Hi all, I'm Lauren, the policy manager here at Shelter Cymru, doing an audio record over the slides from our webinar last week, just due to some technical issues and wanting to make sure there is a version for anybody who wasn't able to join us. So at the webinar last week, we were launching our new report, Local Housing Allowance, a Safety Net Unravelling, a report written by Mark Eaton-Lees, a member of the peer research team here. In the next 10-15 minutes, I'll run through the reasons behind the report, the methodology, the key findings, and then the recommendations. For anyone who's already seen the report, you'll have seen this text exchange early on. It's a text exchange between the research team here at Shelter Cymru and a member of our Take Notice project. The mum who sent these messages and has given her consent to share, she was facing her second no fault, no reason eviction in recent years. And due to the reality of the wait for a social home, the challenges of a potentially indefinite stay in temporary accommodation, she was looking for an alternative private rental for her and her family and was really stuck in the stress of that gap between the support she had through housing benefit and what those real world rents she was seeing online and in estate agent windows, what that looked like and what she would be able to do for her family. So for people who don't know, local housing allowance was a policy introduced in 2008. It didn't replace housing benefit. It was just a new way of setting the maximum amount of money that would be available to anybody accessing housing benefits. Initially, it covered the lowest 50% of rents and was reviewed and uprated each month, but those policies shifted. And currently, the intention behind LHA is for it to cover the lowest 30% of rents in a given area, and it is intended to be uprated annually based on data collected every year. Unfortunately, there's been a significant number of years when the LHA uplift has been frozen. You can see the list of years on the slide there. And just to flag before we go ahead, you'll find in the report and in these slides that we're talking about housing benefit. We're obviously very aware of the changes that were brought through with universal credit, but when we're talking about housing benefit, it's not capital H, capital B housing benefit, but in a more general sense about the different routes of financial support offered through our welfare system that people are able to access towards their rent and housing costs. So as I said at the top, the report has been written by the fantastic Mark Eaton-Lees, and the research that underpins it was led by Mark and then the incredible Katie Jo Pilling, both long-standing members of the peer research team here. Their methodology then was that they completed a web review for available private rented homes that were listed in August 2025 for different areas in Wales. They held a number of conversations with private renters, with Shelter Cymru staff, and other third sector debt and advice staff. And they completed a review of the existing evidence base, particularly the existing fantastic work by the Bevan Foundation and by Crisis. The report pulls out 5 key findings and sets out 4 recommendations for how we can look again at local housing allowance and making sure that it's enabling housing benefit to offer the protection from homelessness, the protection from poverty that we would expect to see from housing benefit and from our welfare system more generally. But first of all, what are the human impacts of LHA and an approach to LHA that is not fit for purpose? In Mark and Katie's web review of private rental listings on popular property websites, they found that in 70% of areas in Wales, there were 0 homes for rent that would be fully affordable for somebody on housing benefit. So in 70% of Wales, there were 0 homes that were within local housing allowance rates. And the other areas where there were homes available, it was between 1 and 5 homes in each area. And that's across all property sizes. That included shared houses, a room in a shared house, all the way up to 4-bed self-contained homes. In August of this year, there was a grand total of 22 options available for somebody or a household who are relying on housing benefit to afford their rent. And of those 22 homes, 8 of them were rooms in HMOs, 7 of those rooms were in Swansea. It really was a disappointingly small pool of options for people. As well as wanting to understand the availability of affordable homes for low-income households, households relying on housing benefit, they also wanted to understand that if somebody was still to take a private rental home of those listed, how much would they be looking to fund as a top up between the LHA rates and the real world rents? Unfortunately, our conversations with private renters highlighted that it's not necessarily the tenure of first choice for people, but it is the only option available. So we know that despite the challenges, particularly the affordability challenges that people will be facing, there will still be people forced into taking these options. And what they found by tracking the cheapest home, the most affordable home listed in each of these areas, and comparing that to the LHA rates based on property size, based on the broad rental market area, what they found was there'd be an average shortfall for any household of around £1,900 each year. So this is a figure mostly for illustrative purposes, but it just shows you the extent to which LHA is not currently fit for purpose and is not protecting people and families in the way that we would be hoping and expecting our welfare system to. To quickly pull out some of the examples within that, the most affordable one-bed home in Pembrokeshire would leave a single person or a couple scrabbling to find an extra 3.5 grand every year between the support they could get through housing benefit, through universal credit, and the real world rent. And unsurprisingly, when we start to look at those 3-4 bed homes, that shortfall increases hugely. And a 4 bed in Brecon and Radnor would see a family trying to find an extra £9,000 every year to top up the gap between the support they have through our welfare system and the real world rents. Fundamentally, local housing allowance as it stands isn't fit for purpose, and it's not protecting renters in Wales from avoiding homelessness or keeping them out of poverty. And for as long as LHA does stay out of step with real world rents, for as long as there is this affordability gap that we're expecting tenants to plug, the policy is disempowering renters. It is meaning that people who are in homes that they can afford feel less able to push for completely essential repairs for fear that their rent would be increased and will no longer be affordable for them. In the casework review that Katie and Mark completed, there were examples of people living with broken locks, with damp, mold, other hazards, all of whom had been too afraid to push for repairs in case their rent was increased. Similarly distressing, similarly disappointing then was the impact for people who are disabled or people with long-term health conditions. Time and time again in conversations, in casework review, conversations with renters or with support staff and debt and advice staff, it was clear that it's become very, very normalised for people to use their personal independence payments to meet the shortfall between LHA and the rent that they're actually having to pay. And PIP is intended for people to cover the additional costs of living with a disability, living with a long-term health condition. And time again, people are being asked to put those funds towards their everyday rental costs instead. What you have on the screen here is a quote from somebody that the peer researchers spoke to who had approached her local authority for a discretionary housing payment and had to give very, very detailed evidence about what her PIP money was used for and why it shouldn't be considered as available funds towards her rent. And we absolutely can't ignore that local housing allowance is a policy where decisions are being made by the UK government, where decisions are being made at Westminster, that absolutely has a huge effect on housing and homelessness, both local and national government here in Wales. When we are told of LHA freezes, it's very much talked about in the terms of cost savings, of cost saving initiatives. But then when we look at spending by local authorities, it soon becomes very clear that it's costs that are moved not costs that are saved. They're savings by the DWP, and those cost burdens are then put onto already incredibly stretched local authority teams. For every £4 spent on discretionary housing payments, the DWP data that's publicly available, that tells us that for every £4 spent on DHPs, £1 is solely being used to backfill shortcomings within LHA. We know that people being priced out of the private rented sector are at greater risk of homelessness, they're at greater risk of having to approach their local authority for support and potentially needing to access temporary accommodation. And that too comes at an astronomical cost to local authorities. Across Wales, we're spending £172 million every year on meeting the demand for temporary accommodation. A demand that, of course, as a society, we should be meeting, but local housing allowance offers us an opportunity to reduce that demand by keeping people in the homes that they're already in and making those homes affordable and sustainable. And again, issues around housing, homes, and homelessness are devolved areas of policy here in Wales. They're areas that the Welsh Government have authority over. And we can't overlook the impact that local housing allowance and other decisions around welfare and benefits that are taken at Westminster have on the Welsh Government's ability to be effective in their aims of making homelessness rare, brief, and non repeated. The position of the Welsh Government is a call for a return of local housing allowance to the median rate, so it would cover the lowest 50% of rents here in Wales. And our previous housing minister, Julie James, raised several times in the Senedd the impact that policies like LHA were having on prevention measures here in Wales, having on schemes like the leasing scheme in Wales and the desirability of that option for private landlords. As we look ahead to the homelessness and social housing allocations bill, we need to be thinking about how will LHA and other welfare policies be impacting the effectiveness of that and impacting the ambitions that the Welsh Government have to end homelessness here in Wales. But this webinar is not about the doom and gloom, it is about the opportunity that is facing us, facing the UK government, facing the Welsh Government, and the recommendations, there's 4 of them in total, 2 of them are interim, more immediate term, and 2 of them are looking further ahead to the longer term. So firstly, we would like to see the uplift to local housing allowance announced in this November's UK autumn budget, in line with the policy and the data that we're collecting to inform local housing allowance, so that the rates are covering the lowest 30% of rents as intended. Secondly, we would like to see an urgent review of the guidance for local authorities regarding discretionary housing payments and personal independence payments to flip the approach on its head, so that rather than asking people receiving PIP to evidence how they are using every penny, instead we're thinking about how that home is part of the map of support, map of personal independence for that person, and is a justifiable use of those PIP payments. Then looking ahead into 2026 and beyond, Shelter Cymru are joining calls for LHA to be returned to the median level to cover the lowest 50% of private rents in every local area, in line with the Welsh Government's position, in line with the position of LHA when it was first introduced. And we are also calling for the Welsh and UK governments to further the conversations around potential for devolution of welfare policy, particularly when that welfare policy directly impacts housing and homelessness and devolved ambitions in those areas. So Diolch, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. If you've got any questions about this report on local housing allowance or our wider work on private renting or other areas, you can reach us on policy-and-research@sheltercymru.org.uk. I'd also like to quickly give a big thank you to the Oak Foundation, who supported this work and our ongoing programme to strengthen the evidence base around the issues private renters are facing here in Wales and the solutions and options that we have as a nation. So thank you all, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.